What's up everyone, Adrian here, and it's been quite a while since I posted the last YouTube video. It's been about I think 3 weeks or so, and I've been on hiatus for a little bit because I was out traveling in Seoul, South Korea for a little bit. That was for about a week's time, and then after that I went to Indonesia to meet up with a couple of homies to go diving in some of the different islands. So that was really cool for what it is, but I'm back in the studio now, I'm making content, and if you haven't been keeping up with me lately, I have been posting a lot more on both my Yokuya Adrian as well as my Yokuya Adrian Instagram handles, both of which I will be dropping down in the description below. But I'm making this video today because out of all the photos that I have taken, and including videos, while I was out there both in South Korea as well as Indonesia, there was just one that stood out to me the most, and why I just felt so compelled to not only take it, but be able to share this with you guys. And it was, and by all means, my Korean is not good whatsoever. I've only just collected this name from Google and tried my best to pronounce it, but here it goes. It's at Gyeokbokgung Palace, and what it is just this very well maintained and preserved palace that is just home to a lot of heritage and culture. And I'll throw up the picture right now. But what just stood out to me was here I am facing the south entrance of this palace, just looking out into quote-unquote the modern world, and here I see the palace gates and just these big glass covered buildings and windows where just companies host. And I'm just thinking to myself wow, I'm in a way in a land that's lost in time, but also here just beyond these palace walls is this really technologically advanced and progressive city. And to me that was just so striking, just being there in that moment. And really what's defining that moment is this theme of contrast. Now as a photographer, I use contrast, and I say this in a we context too because by all means it's more inclusive than that. Contrast is just really everywhere, but ever since I started doing more photography, I've been a lot more aware of it and just using the different kinds of contrast to help tell my story or even just document a certain place and time of what's going on. And through that, I just want to be able to talk about some of the different kinds of contrast that I use in my practice, but also for you photographers out there, how you can use contrast in different ways and just paying more attention to what your surroundings are like, so that way when you're out there in the field, you can create a more effective story or even be able to highlight certain key differences or similarities between one or two or even two or more things. And even as a traveler too, you can just use these quote-unquote photography techniques and tools to get a better sense of what your surrounding is like, and just see what kind of questions that you can raise for yourself and see how you can be much more engaged with your surroundings. So the way that I'm going to be breaking down this video is going to be talking about what contrast is, talking about the different kinds of contrast that there are. Granted, there are so much. I'm just going to be diving into some of the ones that I use on the daily, and I will also provide some photos as well to just supplement what we're talking about as well. So by the end of this video, you should have an understanding of some of the contrast kind of tools or subgenres, and that way when you're out there in the field, you can just notice this more with more intentionality and just pursue art or your whatever creative work that you're doing with just more focus. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and hop right into it. Let's first start off by defining what contrast is. Now, the simple definition of contrast is pitting two or more things against each other and just seeing what the noticeable differences are between them. Now, in a photography context, we can use contrast and the many different forms of contrast to just really highlight and just quickly tell to a baseline understanding what it is that we're trying to convey to someone. Just like how the saying goes, a picture is worth 1,000 words. You can quickly understand what is going on from one frame, just seeing how strikingly different just a couple things are within the frame. I like to put a twist on it and say the fewer things that you are comparing with each other, the easier it is to understand. Granted, you can include other things. You just got to make sure that they're distinct enough so that way when they're in tandem with each other, they are telling more of a clear-cut, distinct story, and they're not just getting messed up or jumbled up in the whole meaning of everything. Now, you can still use contrast when you're traveling out there in the field and just really raise the question of like where it is that you're going and like where it is that you're comparing it to. I myself, whenever I am going out to different countries or like different areas that are just really unfamiliar to me, I really like to just raise the question of like, what is life like over there to where I'm going? So say I'm going to the Philippines or I'm going to like Japan or something like that. I like to take examples of just some of the communities that I have been a part of and just like seeing how what life is like here in the Bay Area and then compare that to where I'm going, so that way it keeps me more engaged. It raises more questions of like the why, the how, and the what of just some of the striking differences are between different cultures and just like different customs and norms. Now that we have defined contrast and its couple different contexts, let's go ahead and hop right into the first type of contrast. The first kind of contrast I do want to talk about while we're here is one that just comes up very often and oftentimes in social media as well. Is going to be color contrast. So when you think of color contrast, think of like your color wheel, and you can also think about this in terms of complementary colors too. So some really notable ones that tend to be used not only within social media but in movies as well as just TV or cinema in general include things like teal and orange, yellow and blue, or red and green. Those are some common ones out there. There are definitely a whole lot more. And I'm gonna throw up a couple other examples to help me like convey this as well. So some things I look out for, especially when I'm doing night photography, is what kinds of oranges or blues or like warm colors and cool colors there are, and how do I accentuate that in like post editing. I feel like in my work at least, when I think of the color like orange or something warm, I just think of something so very like welcoming or inviting, whereas on the opposite end of the spectrum, when I'm using blue or some kind of like cooler tone to just denote something that's very like eerie or mysterious or even maybe unnerving in a way. So by putting those two together, you can definitely get a different kind of like sense of feel or texture of it. It really depends on like what you're trying to do with it or what other colors that you're either editing for or aiming for and what message that you're trying to convey. So kind of expanding the umbrella a little bit more, when it comes to color, there's also like tonality when it comes to the kind of contrast there is. So a couple other examples that I have would be like, say, this castle I visited when I was in Japan. Very much so, to simplify it, I use more of like a black and white kind of tone. Not to say that tonal contrast is purely black and white, but kind of branching off into the color kind of contrast as well, is that you're using different tones of different shades of colors to go ahead and convey like what it is that you're trying to like really convey to your audience. So kind of going back to that in somewhat black and white or even bright or dark kind of example with the castle in Japan, I'm using this to make more of like a three-dimensional kind of image that like pops out, but I'm also using it to simplify like this is maybe like a point in time where it's much more you can say like maybe intense or like depending on how like you perceive that kind of tone or color. So tonality can come in different ways, whether you're either using a lot of color or you're using very simple colors or even like lack thereof color. So there's a couple ways that you can go ahead and use this and just look for that in the field. Now the other kind of contrast that I want to talk about is going more into like texture contrast as well. Here's a couple examples of some food items that I have enjoyed while I was out in Japan too. As you can see, there's a theme with Japan going on. But here I have used texture contrast in a couple different ways. So the first one I'm going to be throwing up is going to be a picture of coffee on a brown tabletop. And as we can see with the coffee as well as the tableware itself, they're all very smooth. And just coffee in general doesn't have a lot of pores, just very, depending on how it's made, very smooth surface. But on the surface of the table itself, there's a lot of grains and as well as just texture within the wood itself. So I'm using more of like a contrast between like a smooth surface and a more textured surface, and just really trying to depict like what the ambiance of the place is. Conversely, you can use that kind of texture contrast to talk about what the actual food or item that it is that you're really trying to just accentuate is. Like, so another example that I have is I had matcha while I was at this bamboo garden in Japan to be exact. And what it is that the matcha itself has a lot more pores, a lot more color, and a lot more texture to it. So I just really wanted to emphasize that. And the way that it was served to me was in a bowl that was very much smooth surface, and the plate itself that it was served on, as well as the countertop, very smooth. So doing some post-editing magic, or even just if you're taking a regular picture not using a lot of editing, you could just really hone in about what it is that you're trying to convey about, say, the quality of the food. So to wrap up texture contrast in a way, you can use the texture of, say, the ambiance itself, or like the furniture, to really depict like what the setting of the place is, among other things that you're trying to convey in that image. Additionally, you can use texture contrast on the food itself to really accentuate or emphasize what certain details about it that you want to go ahead and just really like zero in on. Now, going into another kind of one of my favorite kinds of contrast that for me raises a lot of questions, especially when I'm out there in the field, is going to be like more, you can say like philosophical in a way. I think of more like a human versus like nature kind of contrast. So granted, we are way past the days where we are in a primitive state where we're not cavemen anymore, but by all means, like finding a human among nature is, I'd say, like a big disruptor, because it's just so unnatural at this point, because now in our society we live more in like suburbs or even like cities. I mean, to each their own. If you want to go camp somewhere out in the wilderness, you're an outlier, but hey, hope you're chilling. But anyways, like finding just a human within nature itself, where nature, when I think of it, it's like forest, desert, just somewhere void of like humans and just more catering towards like the wildlife and inhabitants there. Just inserting someone in that kind of environment just really speaks out a lot. It could be like, hey, they're adventuring out somewhere, or they're venturing out to the unknown, the big escape out there, whatever it may be. But kind of building off of this like certain subcategory or even umbrella of this type of like contrast, I also like to open up the conversation of seeing like what it is between human and like human made. So this one can get a little bit more fantastical depending on like how you look at it, but I'll throw another example up right now. When I was in Japan back in October 2024, is it 2024? Pretty sure 2024. When I was out exploring Japan with my homie Emilio, we went to this one museum in Tokyo, and part of that museum included the Evangelion exhibit. And what I absolutely loved about this was just not only being able to see like how things were made or just like to scale, but just seeing like the cool little figures and being able to photograph certain cool scenes. But really, I'll throw up a picture right now. It is of Unit 1 as well as Gendo. And as we can see in this picture itself, the crazy part about it is that you can think about this in a sense of, here's a human standing on top of this giant robot that's man-made. So you can think of it more as like, going back to that human versus human made, you can think of it as like more of a organic versus non-organic kind of contrast. So kind of a bit harder to see out there in the field, but something as easy as this, where it's like, oh, it's a mecha anime and now here's a human being. You can kind of combine those together and just really depict like what they're trying to convey within that scene. But also, I kind of want to speak about this a little bit more too, because when we look at this kind of contrast, at least within this context, and you can definitely apply this kind of tool out in different types of environments, is the scale of it. Now, scale, contrast, you're here going back to that Evangelion example, you have little Gendo and you have giant Unit 1, and because you see how a humanoid figure is so much smaller compared to this giant robot, and it's within this 4x5 frame, you can get a better sense of how big certain or small something is. Now, to apply this in a more, I'd say, an organic sense, here I have a picture of my homie Oliver and I took a shot of him from behind while he was walking through this path down in the redwoods in Northern California. And as we can see in a very small section in the center frame, we have Lil Oliver, and here we have these giant redwood trees. And to this note, we can tell just by how small Oliver is and just some of the other elements that help guide our eyes to see where he's at relative to everything else. These redwoods are just super giant, even though that they are covered by most of the fog and other ambiance in that space. So that right there is a scale contrast in a nutshell. building off of the human versus human made kind of example. Now, some of these other types of contrasts that I want to get into I'd say a little bit more philosophical as well, depending on how you look at it. While I was out there traveling in Seoul too, kind of referring back to the Gyeokbokgung Palace example, there's culture contrast. Now, you can take this in so many different avenues and ways. I like to think of it as, here I am, a US-born citizen visiting another country, and I am taking elements from what I've seen growing up and just being around like so many different Asian cultures, and how do I take what I've already know and apply it into this kind of sense. And what I can say, kind of going back to the Gyeokbokgung Palace example, is that at least in the States, there's not a lot of places where these different kinds of like racial groups or ethnic communities like kind of have like, in a way, not really a strong physical presence, just more of a general presence. What I mean by that is that when I think of heritage preservation, some places that come to mind would include like Japantown, San Jose, or like Japantown, San Francisco, Chinatown, San Francisco. So some of those places, they do incorporate some like influences depending on which demographic that we're talking about. And just outside of that predefined area is this just more city-like, Americanized kind of setting, which is, I'd say, it's really nice to see how different communities can find their pockets and like footholds relative to like the greater general mass. But when I visited South Korea, and kind of also from my experience visiting Japan as well too, is I see these more traditional homes like the hanuks, or even some of these palaces that have been really well preserved, and they have their predefined areas. At the same time, they can just coexist and just live in parallel to this ever so changing, technologically advanced and modern society. And I just find that really quite striking how, and also beautiful how well that this kind of heritage and culture can be kind of preserved in that sense. So I'll throw up a couple other examples, but mainly like that Gyeokbokgung Palace example was one that just spoke out to me. There was a couple other ones, like kind of building off the Japan example a little bit. If you haven't been already, definitely highly recommend checking it out. But there are places, like, I mean, throughout Japan, and what I noticed in my last moments in Tokyo too was, here I am just going through the alleyways and just taking photos, and here I am coming across a shrine, and the next moment I know, once I get out of the alleyway, I come into like this big tall skyscraper building that just lights up at night, so which is really cool. But again, it's that sense of like heritage and culture preservation, which is, I think, really cool, just from my visitor standpoint, but also like I kind of sense from the other side of the table where it's like, this is something that's really important and something to definitely be respected. In terms of this kind of contrast of like cultural, I think that we can expand it a bit more too, and just something that I've recently captured myself, and I don't really see too often, but like definitely something worth noticing, is a bit of like a generational kind of contrast. So here I have a picture of, here I am in Myeongdong, which is a part of Seoul where there's a lot of nightlife and just activity going on, but it just really comes alive at night. A lot of young people, a lot of tourists tend to congregate there, but in this picture that I have right over here, I have 3 salarymen over here, and they're just having a swell, jolly time, but by their expressions and just how they're conversing with each other, they just seem more animated and lively given their age. And in this group behind them, I see this like, I think, trio of like maybe, I don't know, like college students or even just adults in the workforce. I don't even know, but just by their looks alone, to me it kind of signals that they are younger compared to the men in front of them. And that generational or kind of like age kind of contrast just really spoke to me in the sense that here we are in this like area known for like having a lot of young hip people or even like just tourists, and here we have a group of like more middle-aged men just hanging out, just being so lively, in contrast to some of the more laid-back and chill kind of group that's just right behind them. And I felt like that, to me, just stood out a little bit more, and just something worth noting about, because by all means, we're a kid at heart at times. We have dived into many different types of contrasts, but there are definitely more out there. However, these are just some of the ones that I tend to use myself. So now that you have a sense of what kind of contrast for you as a photographer to like consider or use in your toolkit, definitely let me know, or like tag me in some of your photos that you use some of these tools if this video did help you out. I want to see like what you're creating while you're out there. Additionally, if you do like the content, go ahead and drop a like and subscribe as well, so that way you're in the loop about what I do. And as always, go ahead and try checking me out. Check me out over on Instagram at both my travel accounts. Now the Yokuya Adrian one, that one's gonna be more of like a travel account in the sense that like I'm not taking a lot of photos, but I'm really focusing on videos and short form video content. And as for the Kuya Adrian one, that one's gonna be mainly the photography one, where I'm gonna be sharing more tips and tricks, as well as just like photo, like just photo ideas onto there, and just some of my pictures for that I've edited throughout like just my travels. But yeah, if you guys really enjoyed the content, really appreciate it if you give it a like. And until next time, I'll see you guys around, and have a good one. Peace out.